Okay, so if you go into this idea of individualism, then if every individual is born of the devil, then every individual has an equal chance of going to heaven, or equally large chance of going to hell, I guess, uh, given their access to education. So one of the fundamentalist aspects of Calvinism was that everyone had the potential to go to heaven. So you had to give everyone the skill set by education, so they had the option of going to heaven. So therefore, if they end up not taking advantage of, if they don't read the Bible, if they don't, buy into the Calvinist logic, then they go to hell in full knowledge that they've made that choice. So one of the key tenets of Calvinist for believers was that you had to give everyone else the ability to make the choice. And this is why, for example, Salem witch trials, you can burn women at the stake. And that's simply because from the Calvinist standpoint, they made their choice to not follow the Calvinist logic, so therefore burn them. So again, the Calvinists are just stunningly intolerant. But this idea of individualism, of course, also has sort of an innate equality. So what this also means then is everyone has to stand on their own abilities in terms of how they're going to be judged. It doesn't matter who your parents are, because that's not going to help you when you get to the gates of heaven. You're only going to get to heaven and have the option of going to heaven based on whatever you've done, not what your family connections or history are. And this is where Calvinism entirely breaks ranks with all the other forms of Christianity that you see that were and still are so powerful in Europe, where social connections and genealogy and kinship are absolutely central to people's social status. In the Calvinist logic, social status was entirely defined on your own performance. And so in this context, for example, the person that starts up with nothing and becomes the millionaire, these are the famous Horatio Alger stories of the 19th century of the kid selling matches who becomes a billionaire or something like that. They were so beloved to Americans, which Europeans, other places would read those stories and they go like, that's totally unrealistic. But in the United States, people bought into it. It's still very much part of the American mantra of self-success. If you're someone like Donald Trump, you have to downplay the fact that your family had money, especially your dad, and you have to make it sound like you basically made your own way in the world. Because if you don't, if you actually make it clear that you went to elite private schools because your dad paid for it, then actually loses you points in the American idea of who's better. So someone who inherits a lot of money is not as good as someone who has to make their own money and starts from zero. So this becomes a huge part of what makes Americans different than Europeans, and in many ways also sort of different than the Canadians, who don't have much more European attitude of connections. Other part of this then is also that the individual rights become dominant. If God gives everyone the chance to go to heaven or go to hell, then it's the function of the group is to get out of everyone's way. So what you get is the very peculiar American legal system where the rights of the individual are dominant and the rights of the group are pretty much, not non-existent, but pretty much limited, because the group shouldn't be able to tell individuals what to do. Because, if an individual does something in this world, then they're going to go to heaven and be judged. And they're supposed to be aware of that. And that's supposed to control their behavior. Doesn't, but that's the logic of it. So therefore, in Calvinism, individuals are responsible for all this. And if this becomes, of course, a huge part of, especially the conservative, social political rhetoric in the United States in 2023, is this idea of individual rights versus the group. And this became a huge issue during COVID, for example, with masking. Individuals get to make their own choices. A very American way of looking at anything that involves more than individual, because in America, the individual is always central. We're an individual-centric society, and that's because the Calvinists. The other groups coming over here didn't have that. British aren't individual-centric. Europeans aren't individual-centric. The other forms of Christianity aren't really that individual-centric as the Calvinists. But you have to remember, by the turn of the 19th century, Calvinism is what people learned in school. It was the educational system was the Calvinist values. Everyone in school got individual grades. Everyone in school followed the time class in terms of recess and courses. Everyone in school had individual grades for the work that they did. Everyone in school was successful or failed based on their own abilities. And that's quintessential Calvinism. It's put out in a context where people don't see it as Calvinism because they don't understand it's really religiously based. Now, if you just look at this one here, this sort of reiterates a lot of that. So groups only are a collection of individuals. having said that, of course, to a certain extent, individuals also want to be role models for other members of the group. So if you become successful on your own merits, you're going to do a lot of walking around and buying stuff, and being visibly successful is a really big thing to do, because that's supposed to motivate other people to try to be like you, and that's going to tend to make them work harder and then get their access to heaven better. So if you consume a lot and you consume visibly, like the Kardashians or something like that, then to a certain extent you're being very Calvinist, because you're making other people jealous, and in their jealousy they're going to work harder, and so you've actually helped them, you've helped to motivate them to work harder and get a better chance of going to heaven. It's a very, very peculiar Calvinist type of thing. But if you think about it, you see this classically, for example, those in interior design. When someone's lived in a house for 10 years and they feel like they need to remodel it, it might not be because there's been any change in terms of social dynamics of who's in the house. It's just the idea that after 10 years, everything's gotten, quote, old. You need to have a new updated look to the place. That's very, very much Calvinist, because you want to also make sure to your neighbors that you have the money to spend, and you want to be seen spending it on things, because that spent money is a reflection of the work that you do. Because remember, time has value. So buying a new car every 3 to 5 years has nothing to do with the fact that it's going to be more reliable. Well, it's oftentimes an excuse. It has to do with the fact that you have to be seen in a new car, because if you drive the same car for 10 years, that's being lazy, and that's not a good thing. That's a morally decrepit thing. So, the idea that you have to have the new and better, the new and improved, not only is because you feel that you need it individually, but you also need to illustrate to the collective that you're being a good Calvinist, and you're being a good Calvinist by virtue of doing these things. Because you have to remember, again, the Salem witch trials were based on the collective, not buying into some people's attitudes. So if you combine this with a very, like I mentioned last time, I did, that Americans are very externally driven. Our self-value is very much based on how others see us. And you tie this to the Calvinism, and this explains the American fascination with buying junk. That you have to have the newest thing. You have to have the new iPhone or the new Samsung phone or the new whatever, and you have to be seen having it, because what you're saying to everyone else is not only am I new and better, but I have the resources to have this thing. And of course, this is why people buy cars on leases. This is why they buy houses they can't afford. This is why they buy new iPhones on payment plans through their, IP providers, so that they can look like they actually paid cash for it. It's very, very much part of the American thing. And if you think about it, this is why Americans are involved in interior design. Interior design is the idea that you put in new stuff to replace old stuff, but you then visibly have to have people come over to your house to be impressed with the new stuff that you've got, or else just self-impress yourself with the fact that you bought this new stuff, or you bought this new stuff, even if it's not as comfortable as the old one, but it costs $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. And that's a reflection of your values. So we value ourselves and the stuff that the amount of money we have, and the stuff that we buy. Notice one of the spin-offs, because all the stuff attaches it together. Notice that being wealthy is morally good. Being poor is morally bad. Having stuff, having new stuff, having a bigger car, having a Porsche or a Mercedes versus a Kia, all of this becomes part and parcel of the reflection of success and being good. So in the United States, morality and consumerism are the same thing. And they're all based on this Calvinist moral logic, moral religious logic. In Europe or other parts, in Asia, for example, Chinese are huge consumers, but Chinese consumption isn't moral. Chinese consumption is because you want to impress on others the success that your family's had. So you're basically hyping up your family and your individual success, and having stuff, especially that other folks don't have, to brag to them how good your family is. So there isn't the moral religious component. It's my family's better than yours. It's a very competitive thing. The American part is competitive, but not necessarily. It's more tied to the idea that emotional, social, moral values are tied to things. Now, not surprisingly, in a view that basically commodifies this, is one of the other things Calvinists very quickly commodify is property. So the amount of property you have, both in the size of the property and also the type of property, becomes another manifestation of success, just like the type of house that you put on it. And so individual self-worth, because we're externalized, is based on how we're viewed by others. Now, one of the other side effects of this from a design standpoint is you've got a structure, say a residence or a home, you have to fill it up. If you've got a yard, you got to put bushes in it. You've got to put a lawn in it. You've got to put all this stuff in it to, again, show that you can afford it. But also, especially lawns, which are peculiarly American, is that then you have to go and mow the lawn. You have to make sure the lawn stays green. You have to do all the stuff in the lawn, because that, again, shows that's a modern version idea of work again. So what you find is empty space in the Calvinist view is bad. Empty space is like another version of the devil's work, or screwing around. So space should always be filled. Space should always be used. Space should always be modified. Let's switch here for a second. Okay, so this brings us back to that image I showed you last time. We're going to see this one again. You get really tired of this image. What you have here is a colonial style house. Now, this is a prefab, but because of the American need to manifest wealth and manifest success in the way that we build our environment around you, what is basically just a classic single roof line bungalow. You put this absolutely enormous portico on it, which is largely not functional. You've got these totally non-functional skylights. I don't know what you want to call them. There's a technical term that escapes me. You've got this huge lanai or porch in the front. And you've got this, brick, which I can guarantee is not actually entirely brick, but it's probably glued on brick faced. You've got all this stuff here, which basically makes this house look like it's worth more than it cost. And this is a key part of this American value system. If you've got this idea that you manifest wealth through the things that you own, then having a house that is a display of wealth is a necessity. And if you're really clever, then what you do is you have a house that displays more wealth than it actually cost you, because that's going to look better than the neighbors, and that's going to one-up you on everyone. This idea of doing better than the Joneses, for example, the classic slogan of the suburban American life. This is a quintessential example. There's so much about this place. There's, if you could write an entire dissertation on this particular structure. But for our purposes right now, this is a classic manifestation of Calvinism. The person that owns this stuff spent less than if they'd had this house built as a classic structure. It's got totally disproportionate uses of unusable space versus usable space, because this might be unusable from a structural point of view, but in terms of ego, statement, relationship with neighbors, and expression of worth and value, it's very used space. So this is very much a Calvinist built environment residence. And in that regard, it's a really good example of this logic sort of played out in the landscape. Okay, so when we're looking at this, then you have to remember that among other things, going back to the sort of traditional Christian view, as with the other West Asian religions, God doesn't put people in as part of the species of the planet. God puts people in management of everything also. So this idea of superiority stewardship. And so one of the side effects of this, of course, is being civilized, which the Calvinists, of course, means their version of civilization, means literacy, Christianity, et cetera, in their value system. This becomes a necessary goal. So when the Calvinists moved to North America, their interaction with Native Americans pretty much fall to two venues. One is you teach the Native Americans to be Calvinists, teach them the Bible, and sort of incorporate them into your system, sort of. If they don't accept that, then you wipe them out. Because if you give people an option to be civilized in the way that you interpret civilization, they reject it, then they're the devil's children. And at some point, your moral compass then doesn't involve dealing with them. They just become part of the problem with the world around you. They don't become part of the solution. So being a solution becomes being Calvinist. Being part of the problem is rejecting that. And so what you find then is, especially for Calvinists, the idea of domestication, this control of nature, becomes a huge part of Calvinism, because controlling nature requires a lot of work, whether it be cutting down trees to make an open field, whether it be mowing a lawn, whether it be trimming hedges into rectangular shapes like we see on campus. All of this becomes a key part of reflecting work and effort. Either directly in the fact that you shape the hedges. But if you notice that at our campus, the folks that run the campus don't do any of the maintenance work. The maintenance work is all done by people that are hired, but they're paid for it. So you either do the work yourself, you pay someone else to do the work, to reflect this idea of domestication, control, and work, labor, effort, and money, which all becomes sort of rolled into a ball of stuff. So in this view, then natural, is sort of an anathema. Natural is outside of Christianity, is outside of Calvinism. And to a certain extent, almost seen as outside of God, which is sort of odd when you think that, everything was manifest in the Garden of Eden, whatever. Now, one of the side effects of this, especially for Americans then, is that if you give people access to American education, if you give people access to the learning, the values and systems of Calvinism, and they reject them, then to a certain extent, they've had a chance to be Americans and be saved and go to heaven. If they choose not to, then you don't really need to worry about them or take them seriously or do anything for them because they basically become children of the devil. It's also an easy way to stereotype folks that don't follow the sort of Calvinist American view of stuff. Now, one of the other side effects of that, of course, if you're truly into this Calvinist value system, which Americans are, the sort of logic ethnocentric stretch of this is that everyone else in the world really wants to become an American if they could. So one of the things you should do if you're American, if you're part of the system, is export the American system, export literacy, export the Bible, export all the stuff that makes Americans who they think they are, including consumerism. And everyone else in the world will jump on that bandwagon because that will give them these things that the Calvinists have promised because that's what they want. That's the American assumption. Americans still, for some reason, seem to be really shocked when most of the rest of the planet sort of goes like, why would we want to be like you? Americans find that really hard to grasp why everyone else doesn't see the American system as being vastly superior to their own. And then Americans are incredibly ethnocentric. To a certain extent, maybe our success has made that worse, but we were ethnocentric even 100 years ago when America was not a major power. So it's just part of this whole sort of peculiarly Calvinist system is that it's very strong ethnocentrism. And also then plays out in the United States with minority groups or other groups that don't buy into this, then become, immediately sort of negated because if you have access to it, if you're in the United States and you choose not to follow this system, then you've actively made a choice to be the child of the devil. And so therefore, there's no moral social obligation to help you out or do anything for you. In fact, maybe it should work against you and, for example, deport you if you're not willing to be like us in that sense. Here's a chart comparing this to the Hawaiian system. Now, the reason it's key is because in 1821, the Calvinists come here. Well, one of the last places the Calvinists as a religious movement show up. The Calvinists in the 1819 send a group of Calvinist educators to Hawaii to save the Hawaiians from the Euro-Americans that are already in Hawaii that, as far as the Calvinists are concerned, are bringing Hawaiians into a world of sin. So to save the Calvinists save the Hawaiians from other Euro-Americans, specifically a large number from New England, the Calvinists send a religious group over to teach the Hawaiians Calvinist values, literacy, the Bible, etc., how to basically turn Hawaii into part of Massachusetts, if you want to think of it that way. By the time they come over here in 1820, they're no longer any sort of a power group in North America. But this is one reason why public education or educating Hawaiians becomes an absolute key component of the Calvinist value system here. And this makes this very different because the Calvinists did not send large groups to California, did not send large groups to Colorado or other parts of the United States as it expanded west. They were the public schools, but the American system was sort of already in place. Hawaii is the last place in the world that actually gets the Calvinists coming as, in very much the same form that they came to Massachusetts in the 1820s or whatever, where it's the classic religiously explicit, very intolerant, this is the way the world is, this is your way to salvation, way of doing stuff. For a set of very complex reasons, the ruling chiefs in Hawaii at that period in the 1820s grab onto the Calvinists because there's certain political, social logics where being pro-Calvinist is useful if you're part of the ruling family here. So it wasn't so much that the ruling family was really that interested in Calvinism. It's just that it was very useful to appear to be pro-Calvinist. And so what happens is Calvinism becomes the religious system in Hawaii in the 19th century for Hawaiians because it's pretty much the one that becomes de rigueur because the royal family and its various other power elites jump on the Calvinist bandwagon and sponsor it, much more so than it did in New England. So you end up in a weird situation by, say, the 1860s that were actually more Calvinist here than they were in Massachusetts in 1860. So we don't have American normal religious movements here. They pretty much get intentionally left out. The Catholics, for example, are thrown back out of Hawaii in the 1830s because the Calvinists convinced the monarchy that the Catholics are people living in sin. So the Calvinists who were supporting the monarchy were actually very good at keeping other forms of Christianity out that might have been competing. And so Hawaii ends up with a very skewed version of Christianity here that becomes intimately linked to the royal family. And it makes this a very, very different place in the US mainland in the same period of time. The other groups that come over here in the plantation period, of course, then are exposed to that Calvinism because that's the reason for the public schools. The plantation schools are Calvinist based, just like the US counterparts. But even more so because of the stronger form of Calvinism that you find here, almost like the 1680s form of Calvinism here. So Hawaii's in a really weird situation that Hawaiians get stuck with real conservative traditional Calvinism a good 200 years after the United States had left that far behind. And so this classic, dichotomy of the Calvinist view of the world and the, Hawaiian view at the point of contact with Calvinism in the 1820s, just the enormous differences between the two are really important if you're understanding how things function here and don't function here. It has to do with these stresses and conflicts between these two value systems. Okay. Takeaways, pretty much, those are I've already talked them over, and that's the key here is that this is why if you talk to Europeans or even Canadians or other folks, they say America is a very religious country. The American value system is very religiously based, and Americans are sort of like, well, no, it isn't. The value system is this, but if you go to church, that's that. But the reality is the American system is very religiously based, and the weird part is most Americans don't understand how religiously based it is, because that religion's become sort of embedded and almost is dyed into the educational system. And so it's not separable. And this makes it radically different than when you go almost any place else in the world. Now we're going to see this in our built environment because it's this logic system that defines the American cultural landscape built environment from the colonial period right down to the near future.